The slice of white bread felt impossibly soft between Jung Hyun-woo's calloused fingers, like touching a cloud made solid. He held it up to the light filtering through the mess hall windows of the American prisoner of war camp, marveling at its pure white color and spongy texture that seemed to compress and spring back at his touch. Around him, dozens of other North Korean prisoners sat in stunned silence, staring at similar slices on their metal trays while the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a smell so foreign and intoxicating that some men unconsciously leaned forward, inhaling deeply as if trying to capture and understand this mysterious essence. It was October 1951, 6 months into Jung's captivity, and this morning's breakfast represented something far more profound than simple nutrition. Here was bread that was whiter than fresh snow, softer than silk, sweeter than any grain product he had ever tasted. Beside it sat a steaming cup of black coffee, bitter yet strangely compelling, unlike anything in his previous experience. For a man who had grown up eating coarse barley bread and drinking water or weak tea, this meal seemed like something from a fairy tale. Too luxurious to be real, too abundant to be sustainable, too generous to be offered to enemy prisoners. Jung had been a rice farmer before the war, working terraced fields in a village near Wonsan where his family had grown grain for generations. The bread he knew was dark and dense, made from whatever grain was available and mixed with whatever fillers could stretch the precious flour. Sometimes sawdust, sometimes ground acorns, always coarse and difficult to chew. The idea that bread could be this white, this soft, this purely made from wheat alone, seemed to violate everything he understood about food production and resource allocation. This is the story of that slice of bread and that cup of coffee, simple foods that would challenge everything these prisoners thought they knew about their enemies, their own society, and what modern civilization could achieve when abundance replaced scarcity as the organizing principle of daily life. The Korean War had erupted in June 1950 with both sides confident of swift victory. North Korean forces, backed by Soviet equipment and revolutionary fervor, had swept across the 38th parallel expecting to reunify their divided homeland within weeks. Jung and thousands like him had marched south believing they were liberating their brothers from American puppet masters, convinced that the capitalist forces would crumble at the first encounter with determined socialist warriors. Instead, Jung found himself trapped in a grinding conflict that consumed the Korean peninsula in flames. By the time he was captured during the UN counteroffensive in April 1951, his initial confidence had been eroded by months of hunger, cold, and the brutal reality of modern warfare. He expected execution when American soldiers found him wounded and hiding in a bombed-out farmhouse near the 38th parallel. What he didn't expect was to be processed through a systematic intake procedure that included medical examination, clean clothing, and his first encounter with American military rations. The initial meal, white bread, processed meat, and coffee, was so foreign to his experience that he initially suspected it was some form of psychological warfare designed to weaken his revolutionary resolve through decadent capitalist luxury. The white bread was the most shocking element. In North Korea, white bread was a luxury reserved for the highest party officials and foreign dignitaries. Ordinary citizens, even soldiers, ate bread made from mixed grains that produced a dark, dense product with a coarse texture and bitter taste. The whiteness of American bread seemed to represent not just refined flour, but refined civilization itself, a level of processing and purification that required industrial capacity beyond anything Jung had imagined. The coffee was equally mysterious. Jung had heard of this beverage from propaganda descriptions of capitalist decadence, but he had never tasted it or even seen coffee beans. The bitter, complex flavor was unlike anything in his experience, yet there was something compelling about it that made him want to continue sipping despite the unfamiliarity. The fact that this exotic beverage was being served to prisoners of war seemed to confirm every capitalist stereotype about American waste and excess. But as days turned to weeks in American custody, Jung began to understand that what he had interpreted as wasteful luxury was actually routine abundance. The white bread appeared on breakfast tables every morning without fail, accompanied by butter, jam, and other spreads that transformed it from simple sustenance into something approaching a pleasure experience. The coffee was served not just at breakfast but throughout the day, available to anyone who wanted it, as if the Americans possessed unlimited quantities of this exotic substance. The prison camp where Jung was housed operated according to Geneva Convention standards that seemed impossibly generous compared to North Korean military practices. Prisoners received 3 meals a day featuring foods that most North Korean civilians had never seen. White bread with real butter, coffee with milk and sugar, processed meats and cheeses, canned fruits and vegetables that retained their color and texture through mysterious preservation techniques. Captain Morrison, the American officer who commanded the camp, had explained through interpreters that proper nutrition was essential for prisoner health and morale. This concept, that feeding prisoners well served practical purposes beyond mere humanity, was foreign to Jung's understanding of how captivity should function. In North Korean military culture, prisoners were expected to survive on minimal rations as punishment for their failure to fight to the death. The abundance was overwhelming for someone accustomed to viewing every grain of rice as precious. Jung watched in fascination and horror as American guards casually discarded half-eaten slices of white bread, poured out unwanted coffee, and threw away food packaging that would have been treasured in North Korea for reuse or trading. The waste seemed criminal to a man raised in a culture where nothing edible was ever discarded, and even stale bread was saved for mixing with soup or porridge. Private Kim Kol-soo, a former machine gunner who had been captured alongside Jung, struggled to understand American attitudes toward food consumption. "They give us bread that would feed my family for days, and they act like it's nothing special," he whispered during evening conversations in the barracks. "Yesterday I saw an American soldier take 2 bites of bread and throw the rest in the garbage. In my village, we would have fought over those scraps." The daily routine of bread and coffee service became a window into American industrial and organizational capacity that was as impressive as it was bewildering. Fresh bread arrived at the camp regularly, delivered by supply trucks that seemed to operate with clockwork precision. The bread was uniform in size, color, and texture, suggesting mass production techniques that could create thousands of identical loaves. The coffee came in large metal containers that kept it hot for hours, indicating sophisticated logistics that could deliver fresh brewed beverages to remote locations. Jung began to realize that the white bread and coffee weren't just food and drink. They were products of an entire economic system that prioritized abundance over scarcity, uniformity over variation, and consumer satisfaction over mere survival. The same factories that could mass-produce perfect white bread could also manufacture weapons, vehicles, and equipment at rates that North Korea could never hope to match. The same distribution networks that delivered coffee to prisoner-of-war camps could supply frontline troops and civilian populations anywhere in the world. The contrast with North Korean food production was stark and troubling. Jung remembered the coarse bread of his childhood, made in small batches by local bakers using whatever grain was available. The texture varied from day to day depending on ingredients and weather conditions. Sometimes the bread was edible, sometimes barely palatable, but it was always scarce and therefore precious. The idea that bread could be mass-produced to consistent specifications and distributed widely enough to feed enemy prisoners seemed like fantasy. The coffee represented an even greater mystery. Jung learned from American guards that this beverage was grown in distant tropical countries, shipped across oceans, processed in specialized facilities, and distributed to ordinary citizens who consumed it daily as a matter of routine. The global supply chain required to deliver coffee to a remote prison camp in Korea involved coordination between multiple countries, shipping companies, processing facilities, and distribution networks on a scale that boggled the mind. Sergeant Williams, an American guard from Ohio who had volunteered to help explain American customs to curious prisoners, tried to describe coffee culture in the United States. Through halting communication and gestures, he explained that most American adults drank coffee every morning, that coffee shops existed in every city, and that the beverage was so common that restaurants served it for free with meals. For Jung, this description painted a picture of abundance that seemed almost mythical. Every day, Jung asked through an interpreter, "All Americans drink coffee every day?" The concept challenged everything he understood about resource allocation and social organization. In North Korea, luxury items were rationed according to political status and party loyalty. The idea that ordinary citizens could consume exotic beverages daily suggested a level of prosperity that seemed impossible given his understanding of how economies functioned. The white bread served similar lessons about American productive capacity and social priorities. Jung learned that this bread was made from wheat grown on massive farms using industrial agriculture techniques, processed in large mills that could produce tons of flour daily, and baked in commercial facilities that supplied entire regions. The uniformity and quality of the bread required sophisticated quality control systems that ensured consistent results across thousands of production batches. But perhaps most shocking was the casual attitude Americans displayed toward these remarkable foods. For Jung and his fellow prisoners, white bread and coffee represented almost unimaginable luxury, foods so precious they should be savored slowly and gratefully. For American guards, they were routine parts of daily life, consumed without ceremony or special appreciation. This difference in perspective revealed fundamental distinctions between societies organized around scarcity and those built on abundance. The social dynamics around food consumption in the prison camp provided additional insights into American culture and values. Jung observed that American guards shared their coffee freely with prisoners who expressed interest, offered extra bread to men who were still hungry, and seemed genuinely concerned that prisoners were receiving adequate nutrition. This generosity toward enemies contradicted everything North Korean propaganda had taught about capitalist cruelty and selfishness. Corporal Johnson from Alabama, who worked in the camp mess hall, began teaching interested prisoners about American food culture through simple demonstrations and shared meals. He showed them how Americans typically ate bread, with butter and jam, as toast, or as sandwiches filled with meat and vegetables. He explained coffee preparation techniques, demonstrated how milk and sugar could modify the flavor, and shared stories about coffee shops and diners back home in America. These informal cultural exchanges gradually broke down barriers of misunderstanding and hostility that had made the war seem like a conflict between incompatible civilizations. The simple act of sharing bread and coffee created moments of human connection that transcended political ideology and national identity. Jung found himself looking forward to these conversations, eager to learn more about the society that could produce such abundance and share it so generously even with enemies. As winter approached in late 1951, the white bread and coffee became even more precious to prisoners facing cold weather and shortened daylight hours. The warm, filling bread provided comfort and energy, while the hot coffee offered warmth and a stimulating effect that helped combat the depression and lethargy that often affected men living in captivity. American guards noticed these effects and began providing extra coffee rations during particularly cold periods, a humanitarian gesture that further demonstrated their commitment to prisoner welfare. Jung's understanding of American society continued to evolve as he observed the casual efficiency with which the camp's food service operated. Meals were planned weeks in advance. Ingredients arrived on schedule regardless of weather or military operations, and preparation followed standardized procedures that ensured consistent quality and adequate portions for all prisoners. The system seemed to run itself, requiring minimal supervision or crisis management. The contrast with North Korean military logistics was painful to contemplate. Jung remembered units going days without adequate food supplies, soldiers sharing single bowls of thin gruel, and officers making desperate decisions about how to allocate scarce rations among hungry men. The American ability to maintain abundant food supplies for enemy prisoners while simultaneously supporting their own forces in active combat operations demonstrated organizational capabilities that seemed almost superhuman. By early 1952, many prisoners had developed genuine appreciation for American bread and coffee, looking forward to morning meals that had become highlights of otherwise monotonous camp routine. Some had learned enough English to request specific preparations: toast instead of plain bread, coffee with extra milk, additional portions when they were particularly hungry. These interactions created informal relationships between prisoners and guards that humanized both sides and reduced the tensions that might otherwise have made camp management difficult. The cultural education was bidirectional. American guards became curious about North Korean food culture, asking prisoners to describe traditional dishes and cooking methods. Some guards were shocked to learn about the scarcity and simplicity that characterized North Korean peasant diets, developing new appreciation for the abundance they had always taken for granted. These conversations helped both sides understand that their conflict was rooted in different economic systems and social priorities rather than fundamental differences in human nature. Jung began keeping mental notes about everything he observed regarding American food production and distribution, not as military intelligence, but as personal education about how modern societies could organize themselves to provide abundance rather than mere survival for their citizens. The white bread and coffee had become symbols of possibilities he had never imagined, evidence that human societies could choose prosperity over poverty, pleasure over mere sustenance, and generosity over hoarding. As 1952 progressed and news of the war's progress filtered into the camp, many prisoners began to understand that their exposure to American abundance represented more than accidental kindness from individual guards. It was systematic demonstration of American values and capabilities, proof that the society they had been fighting possessed advantages that went far beyond military technology or battlefield tactics. The daily ritual of white bread and coffee service became a form of soft power that was more effective than any propaganda campaign. Prisoners weren't being lectured about the superiority of capitalist systems. They were experiencing the material benefits such systems could provide. The bread was evidence that American agriculture could produce surpluses. The coffee proved that American commerce could access global markets. And the combination demonstrated that American society could afford to be generous even toward enemies. The implications were profound and unsettling for men who had been raised to believe in the inevitable triumph of socialist revolution over capitalist exploitation. If America could afford to feed enemy prisoners better than North Korea fed its own soldiers, what did that say about the relative strength and sustainability of the two systems? If American workers could consume luxury items like coffee daily, while North Korean farmers struggled to grow adequate grain for basic bread, which society was better serving its people's needs? As the war ground toward its eventual armistice in 1953, many prisoners faced the prospect of repatriation with mixed emotions. They would be returning to families and communities they loved, but they would also be leaving behind a world where white bread and coffee were routine rather than miraculous, where abundance was assumed rather than hoped for, and where even enemies were treated with a level of material generosity that challenged everything they had previously understood about human nature and social organization. The repatriation process itself provided one final lesson in American organizational efficiency and humanitarian concern. Prisoners were given farewell meals that included their favorite American foods: white bread with butter and jam, strong coffee with milk and sugar, and care packages containing additional supplies for their journey home. Many chose to save portions of bread and bottles of coffee as souvenirs, tangible reminders of their unexpected encounter with American abundance. Jung Hyun-woo stood at the rail of a repatriation ship in July 1953, holding a carefully wrapped slice of white bread that he had saved from his final breakfast in American custody. The bread had already begun to harden and would soon be inedible, but he treasured it as physical proof of experiences that would be difficult to explain to family members who had survived 3 years of wartime hardship and scarcity. The North Korea he was returning to had been devastated by American bombing campaigns that had destroyed most of the country's industrial infrastructure and many of its cities. The sophisticated food production and distribution systems that had made white bread and coffee possible in American prison camps simply didn't exist in his homeland, and wouldn't be rebuilt for years or even decades to come. But Jung carried with him more than just a piece of bread and memories of coffee. He carried a fundamentally different understanding of what modern industrial society could achieve when it prioritized abundance over scarcity, efficiency over ideology, and material prosperity over revolutionary purity. The white bread and coffee had been more than sustenance. They had been education in the power of consumer capitalism to deliver tangible benefits that improve the daily lives of ordinary people. The story doesn't end with repatriation and the long process of reconstruction. In the decades that followed the Korean War, many former prisoners carried their memories of American abundance as they rebuilt their lives in a homeland struggling to recover from wartime devastation. Some became farmers who experimented with new agricultural techniques they had learned about from American guards. Others became factory workers who applied lessons about quality control and standardization they had observed in American food production. The white bread and coffee served in Korean War prison camps had demonstrated something profound about the relationship between economic systems and human welfare. They had shown that societies capable of producing abundance for their own citizens could also afford to be generous toward their enemies, and that such generosity could be more effective than coercion in demonstrating the superiority of their values and achievements. American guards who had served in Korean prison camps returned to civilian life with enhanced appreciation for the abundance they had always taken for granted, having seen through their prisoners' eyes how remarkable American consumer culture appeared to people from societies built on scarcity and sacrifice. Many continued to think about the North Korean prisoners who had been so amazed by simple white bread and coffee, wondering what had become of them in the years following repatriation. The bread and coffee had created bridges of understanding that transcended political ideology and national identity. They had proven that human beings from radically different cultures could find common ground in their most basic needs and simple pleasures. The taste of soft white bread, the warmth of freshly brewed coffee, and the satisfaction of adequate nutrition had spoken to universal human desires that no amount of political indoctrination could eliminate. But perhaps most importantly, these simple American foods had revealed the power of abundance to transform understanding and create hope for better possibilities. The prisoners who had marveled at white bread and coffee in American camps had glimpsed a world where scarcity was not inevitable, where daily life could include pleasure as well as survival, and where societies could choose to organize themselves around providing comfort rather than merely demanding sacrifice. Today, white bread and coffee are available in bakeries and cafes throughout South Korea, symbols not of foreign occupation, but of prosperity and international connection. The North Korean prisoners who first encountered these foods in American prison camps lived to see their former enemies become allies and partners in building one of the world's most prosperous societies, where abundance had replaced scarcity as the normal condition of daily life. The war ended, the prison camps were closed, and the prisoners returned to their devastated homeland carrying memories that would influence their understanding for the rest of their lives. The slice of white bread had been consumed, the cup of coffee had been finished, but the lessons they represented, that human societies could choose abundance over scarcity, generosity over cruelty, and hope over despair, would prove more durable than any political system and more powerful than any ideology ever created by minds seeking to divide rather than unite the human family. That perhaps is the ultimate legacy of the white bread and coffee served in Korean War prison camps. They demonstrated that sometimes the most profound revelations come through the simplest experiences, that the most effective diplomacy happens not through formal negotiations, but through the basic act of sharing a meal, and that even the bitterest enemies can discover their common humanity in the universal appreciation for soft bread, warm coffee, and the generous spirit that offers both freely. To those in need, the bread had been eaten, the coffee had been drunk, but their message would echo through history, that abundance shared creates understanding, that generosity offered even to enemies demonstrates true strength, and that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are carried not in manifestos or speeches, but in the simple act of offering comfort and nourishment to fellow human beings, regardless of the uniforms they wear or the flags they serve.